Hello, hello in UK Health Radio Land. I'm Liz Larson and I'm here with my friend,
Bill McKenna.
hey, Bill McKenna. And we have a really exciting guest for you guys today. You know that Bill and I, over the last few years, have talked a lot about concussion from our perspective. And today we get to have a real expert and someone who's also helping the world do something about it. So today we welcome Nathan Howarth, who is the director of the Concussion Legacy Foundation UK. Welcome, Nathan.
Lovely. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm really excited, as you say, to have this conversation about concussion and all things brain health.
Yeah, we were talking off camera that Bill and I realized that there's so much more to it. And it sounds like that's something you've come to as well. And we'd love to help people understand more about this because throughout our lives, most of us bonk our head, right? Maybe it's not, a diagnosed concussion. Maybe we don't pass out, but a lot of times, or sometimes, let's say, there are ramifications of that. So we're really excited to hear more about your perspective on that. Would you tell people about the Concussion Legacy Foundation and maybe how you got involved in it?
Sure. So the Concussion Legacy Foundation is a global network of different chapters. So I lead our kind of UK chapter. We have a US where it started in 2007 with Dr. Chris Nowinski and his neurosurgeon, Dr. Robert Cantu. We then had subsequent chapters in Canada and Australia. And what we're all aimed at doing is promoting kind of concussion care without compromise. And we also then have a focus on chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, which is commonly associated with repetitive head impacts. So American football, soccer, or association football, rugby union league, ice hockey, and military service, and even domestic partner violence, and a little bit of self-harm as well, but kind of less obviously, or less the kind of connections are a little bit more different in self-harm. But as a kind of broad organization, we have three core functions, which is advocacy. So looking at how do we reduce the opportunities for repetitive head impact exposures, reduce concussion risk. And then we have kind of the research arm, which is all to do with kind of understanding the brain. So we support research around the world and here in the UK around kind of concussion, post-concussion syndrome. We have a brain bank here and part of a wider network of brain banking to look into particularly CTE, but also to understand those repetitive head impacts and potentially concussions as well. And our third strand is helpline. So we actually are helping those affected by concussions with resources, spaces to talk through the kind of concussion journeys, their caregivers, so whether or not they have parents for children, partners, and even kind of children of those that are suffering from PCS. But we also have caregivers for CTE that we also support. So and CTE support groups as well for their journeys. So it covers a broad array of kind of support services and kind of promotion into CTE and concussion, and kind of within the advocacy work as well. We also do a lot in education, so educating medical professionals, parents, children, participants, but also the media. So we have a really good media project aimed at particularly association football commentators around when they should discuss concussions, how to recognize them, because the reality is that, as you say, most people won't know they've had a concussion. Most concussions won't actually result in a blackout, as less than 10% will be unconscious for any period of time. So we actually need people to recognize their change in themselves to avoid, the most serious impact of concussion, which is second impact syndrome, but also then to potentially mitigate any long-term effects that we sometimes see of concussion.
Nathan, I know I can read Liz's mind. The gratitude is pouring forward from both of us for you and the Concussion Legacy Foundation. The work that you guys do, our heartfelt gratitude for you and all the other people that are that are helping, because we recognize the impact of this globally. Now, the big question that I have, and this is going to probably take a little while to answer, is top 10. People listening right now are like, yeah, okay, I don't think there's really any impact. But there are so many hidden things, and because you're so close to this, even running a global support line on this, tell us, what are the top 10 things of things that you wouldn't know are related, right? First, there's the obvious. Oh, I got a headache. Oh, I'm a little tired. I'm talking about, everything else in a person's life. Tell us, what do you see?
Sure, we see everything. So, those headaches are kind of the first bit and probably also the first bit to resolve for most people. Some people have those and they stay with them for a period of time. But if you were to have there is no such thing as a run-of-the-mill brain injury. However, if you were to have a textbook recovery, you'd probably see that most headaches decrease the next day. So in terms of that kind of symptom, as it were, that can be quite it can resolve even overnight.
It's almost superficial.
Almost. The problem is that I will speak to people that then have headaches as 2, 3, 4, 5 years on from a concussion.
Right.
At that point, it becomes much more entrenched and ingrained in their life in terms of every day they're waking up with headaches. In terms of the kind of majority of people that might not be aware of what happens in terms of there's some really good research put out by the University of Exeter and the University of Oxford, and some colleagues from both universities were involved in this. That they did something called the PREVENT study. They actually found that if you had 4 concussions, but is the main most effective or most effect it has on you is actually it reduces your cognitive ability. So over time, it's not progressive, but compared to baselines, you will lose some of your cognitive ability. So that's something that would be really hard for you to know, but actually is when tested by clinicians and psychologists and neuropsychologists, that they will see a decline in your ability. Now that's also seen with just one concussion. So again, you wouldn't necessarily know that there has been that little decrease of your capacity or potential, if you will, but that has lost slightly. You then have those that, and that's majority of people will experience some form of decline isn't the wrong word and impairment is the wrong word, but kind of loss of that capacity or cognitive capacity. And we're not talking about capacity in terms of consent. We're talking about your ability to do things. Again, very minor, nothing that you'd ever really notice because it's not like you suddenly lost the ability to read. That does happen to some people, but that's kind of less so. Another really common kind of side effects, and you mentioned on it in being tired and fatigue, is sleep disruption. And that sleep disruption in terms of insomnia. So quite frequently post the concussion, people initially will report too much sleeping, hypersomniance, and then might actually then struggle with sleep. So their sleep behavior changes. Now, one of the challenges with sleep behaviors is we're all creatures of habit in everything we do. And sleep is built up upon experience, and a concussion breaks that experiential cycle, particularly with the hypersomniance, that excess sleep, because we need to clean our brain. Our brain has got things that are normally within cells, on the outside of cells, because of the mechanism of action. And you believe different theories in terms of the cells have twisted and then inflame, or they've ruptured, and that leads to inflammation. Both models probably work most of the time, and they're extreme examples of where neurons completely shear. And that kind of build-up of initially that a high sleep drive then changes your sleep behavior post. There's also some evidence around other sleep disorders like obstructive sleep apnea and restless leg syndrome coming into it in terms of those changes in how you sleep post the concussion, particularly post-concussion syndrome. See frequent kind of reporting of those wider sleep disorders. And again, become part of the challenge to treat, particularly when a concussion goes beyond. So, unlike the cognitive kind of abilities decreased, sleep is quite tangible and would be tangible for quite a number of people and could exacerbate symptoms. And we think it's one of the reasons why things like headaches don't go away, and it might be linked to that behavioral change. And that's probably one of the next ones that's seen quite frequently is you change the way in which you act and behave. Again, really subtle in some respects, but others rather more extreme in terms of you're no longer who you were is often the kind of phrase. And that's because the brain injury is a complete spectrum. Whether or not it's as simple as stunned from heading a football to being punched, they're going to do some forms of damage, and they do. So they potentially change your personality and behavior, and link quite closely with that kind of change in behavior is kind of any mental health symptoms. And again, those can be kind of linked to potentially the loss of what you were used to and doing, not necessarily just the symptoms, but clearly if you've got a headache for 24/7 or almost, or every time you're awake, or develops in the day, depending on how that headache manifests in concussion and post-concussion, we can see that kind of change in yourself, and it's quite understandable. Like, similarly, if your sleep is disrupted, your emotions are going to be slightly more challenging to regulate. But we also see that, concussions can precursor depression, anxiety, and those changing moods. Frequently, I talk to people that have kind of almost social anxiety, particularly with spaces, those bright lights. Another one in terms of, seems a kind of linked more towards the physical symptoms is dizziness and that kind of vestibular symptoms. So by vestibular, it's dizziness. Often people find that they feel like they're in a washing machine, things like that. And that's, connected again to just different parts of the brain experiencing damage. So it'd be particularly where we get our balance and coordination from in our cerebellum. It's hypothesized as being particularly affected in some concussions rather than others. Another kind of key area of potential, and it can be extremes, is loss of functioning of a part or feeling in some areas. Those are really extreme, but they have been linked to concussion. So again, those are quite broad. And again, you can get vision problems, kind of difficulty concentrating. There is some thought around potentially can concentration lead to potentially learning difficulties, but again, the evidence is not too clear. But we do know that you will potentially struggle to concentrate, even in just the acute recovery of a concussion, which can last. But as I said, no such thing as a run-of-the-mill brain injury. But if you follow a natural progression back to returning to play, that's 3 weeks of potentially struggling to concentrate and having to layer things on to return, not just to play, but to work, to learning, to socialization, and return to looking at your phone, maybe even doing things like drinking and things like that. Those are all risks that you, whilst having a concussion, you shouldn't really be undertaking in terms of light exposure, drinking alcohol, which invariably comes with certain levels of sport or comes with sport. So doing those things, and I think those are things people don't appreciate in terms of actually when you've had a concussion, you need to remove yourself from screen time, and that has an impact. Particularly, and kind of another one in terms of that socialization is off work, off school, and off sport. Those are big impacts on people's lives, whether or not they cause any secondary effects, as I say, from just those, particularly the first week where you're really limited in what you should be doing. And actually those bits are really important and key in preventing a recurrence or return of symptoms. And I'd say the kind of final one that is big, but it's memory. Some people do struggle with their memory, both short and long term post a concussion. Again, nothing clinical in terms of a progressive decline, but just might not have the same functionality. And again, with all of those, there's potential to work at it and regain it, because the brain is great in terms of neuroplasticity and in a way that we can mold it and kind of change it to being back to normal. But we have to recognize, A, that there was a concussion, B, respect that there was a concussion and give the brain its time to heal and almost extend that capacity that might be lost. So yeah, I think that runs down kind of a pretty broad list of the ways that concussion impacts you as an individual, let alone those that are around you in terms of family and friends.
Yeah, I'm imagining that people listening to this have probably, most people have identified themselves in one of those categories, because it's life that we get bonked in the head. But we have to take a quick break. Let's hear from the good folks at the UK Health Radio Network. And when we come back, let's shift our conversation just a little bit to kids. So UK Health Radio, take it away. Okay, and we're back. We're talking with Nathan Howarth, the director of the Concussion Legacy Foundation UK. And we've been talking about all the things that probably most people don't know are a side effect or could be a side effect of a concussion or a bonk on the head. And you already talked about that maybe a lot of people don't realize they've had what we would classically call the concussion, even though they haven't passed out. Like only 10% have that. Bill and I have had the opportunity to work with lots of kids around this. And it's not something a lot of people are aware of. Kids get concussions. The classic ones, you know, they fell off their bike, car accident, sports. But we find that most boys, just in their rambunctiousness of being boys, have multiple concussions a year. I saw a boy recently who had 5 in the last year, and they were all just from boy stuff, goofing around, messing around. One of the biggest cases that Bill saw was somebody who thought they could do a backflip and landed on their head on the cement. And so with kids, the patterns that we've seen, and Bill and I can't diagnose anything, but we do recognize pattern, is that a child's personality changes often after concussion. And it's longer than that, 3 weeks. You know, they'll possibly start to have a fight with a sibling or a parent. You know, they start to lose affection for certain people in their lives. They start to, like you said, have learning disabilities and anger outbursts, changes in food preference, and of course, sleep and all that. So what have you guys seen about children and this issue?
You know, I just want to throw one other thing, because this is an important thing that we notice, is that in these really big cases, it doesn't go away, which kind of mirrors what the work of Dr. Daniel Amen at the Amen clinics. He says an untreated concussion is an untreated concussion. So we see kids that it's like a year and a half, 2 years later, and the parents almost forget that the kid had a actual concussion, but now the kid is holy high hell, and it's been so for so long that they just consider it, that's the personality.
Yeah.
That's normal. So we want to hear from you about that.
Yeah, and I guess so. We do see, particularly as parents, that are concerned, that contact us, and you know the literature will tell us in regards that kids' brains are in really key stages, and for boys in particular, right up until their mid-20s, in terms of formation of an area of the brain that's really important called the prefrontal cortex. That develops who we are. It develops ways in which we can regulate our emotions, but regulate our behaviors as well, because it gives us our kind of understanding of what right and wrong is in a very simple way, because we take our lived experience and develop those. So kids that experience head injuries can, and particularly, as you say, head injuries that are not diagnosed, which means we haven't given it appropriate rest, we kind of chuck people straight back into either going straight back into the sport at the time, which is a massive risk factor for second impact syndrome and those prolonging of concussion symptoms. But actually, we also see that concussion goes kind of can also then manifest in different ways when we don't then rest the following day. We take them back to school. We take them back into another sport, less contact, but we're raising the heart rate. We're also then expecting them to be the same. And actually, it's the brain is telling us it needs to rest. And then we just compound the lack of rest, and it's almost building up that scar, that emotional scar, the neurological scarring that then changes the way the brain is wired because it's not had that appropriate rest. And to answer your question, Bill, in terms of that kind of the challenge of almost the continuation, well, yes, it will, but it doesn't have to be permanent. We can address symptoms and signs within the brain and can quote unquote treat it, particularly with symptomologies and kind of regressing down to the cause. Now, we're not going to be able to treat in the same way as we would somebody that turned up with a concussion 5 hours ago. But actually, we are able to unpick and unentangle how some symptoms manifest in terms of vestibular rehab. I've worked with some really, really astute clinicians and researchers that have done some amazing things in terms of being able to recenter someone's balance. From my perspective, in terms of sleep, we can resolve some of those issues, particularly the earlier they're caught in terms of changing behaviors. They require investment, as a lot of healthcare kind of interventions require, but they can, resolve no matter how long post a concussion they are. I think it's that there is a challenge there, both in recognizing a concussion acutely. We often don't. I frequently hear about the battles that are had with doctors to recognize that it's a concussion sat in front of them. And that is not a slight at medical professionals, because they deal with a broad array of emergencies and life-threatening emergencies, particularly because concussions end up in an emergency department or in front of a GP, sometimes a GP few days post, and the GP goes, well, I'm not sure. Based upon the presentation today, you've not got a concussion, you might have had one previously. And reducing that kind of definitive diagnosis to a speculative might changes the dynamic of somebody's recovery. Similarly, turning up at an A&E, and I've heard consultants turn around and say, once the headache's gone, you're recovered. Yeah. And we know that's not true. We know that the brain chemistry is changing for at least 12 days plus 14, maybe even more, depending on the individual person. We know blood flow is changing at least, again, a similar time frame, which is why we're going for these kind of 3-week return to plays and gradual reintroductions of tasks and activities just on a basic concussion level. So you can imagine when we don't do those levels of interventions and we kind of go back to normal, or another one is quite classically, we disrupt sleep because we want to make sure they're still alive, so we wake them up every 2 hours. Well, no, that if you're concerned about those kind of ends of the spectrum of head injuries, they need to be scanned and they need to be in hospital, not sent home and checked every 2 hours, because disturbing sleep is the worst thing you can do potentially in the first few hours of that recovery. And bringing back that kind of, that leads us to those that then need more intensive interventions, because those have that kind of behavior habits of the brain and its habits of the neurological system, not just your conscious habits, are then taken a hold. And as I say, it's not a slight on the medical professional. Most medical schools don't teach concussion, and it unfortunately sits low on the priority list, even though probably about 1 million people will attend an A&E with a form of head injury, most commonly a concussion. So, from a sheer health burden point of view, there is a frequent number of head injuries.
Well, the problem is it's an injury most of the time that you can't see. Yeah. I always equate it this way. Like if you run into something in your arm and you get a big bruise, it's an indication from the body that there's an injury there, and you need to be careful there. You don't keep running into it. You don't want to keep touching it, right? From that visible physical discoloration that you've had an injury, the body needs to recover. But the brain, most of the time you cannot see it. And so if you imagine the brain itself hitting the edge of your skull and creating, let's say, for lack of a better term, a bruise that you can't see, but then you keep using that area, you don't rest, you don't know that anything needs to heal. You seem normal, you're walking, you're talking, you're doing your thing. It feels healed. But what Bill and I, the pattern that we have noticed is that must take for some people much, much longer to heal. Or maybe the injury is much worse than a person initially anticipated. Or maybe it's the part of the brain that got bonked that creates that. But what we've seen is there are people who they've had a lot of concussions and don't really seem to have any fallout. But then you've got a person who has maybe even a minor concussion, like maybe they didn't pass out or they didn't have to go to the hospital. And that concussion seriously impacts and affects their life. I recently had a new hairdresser, and it's somebody I know, but I hadn't spoken with her in length. I've seen her before in passing, same salon I go to for nails. And she was saying she kind of stepped back off the mat, and I could tell that she needed to catch her balance. I said, "Are you okay?" And she said, "Well, because I know that this is the work you do, I have really bad vertigo." Okay. So we started to chat about where did the vertigo, it just came out of nowhere. I've had it about 4 years. So I said, let's go back and talk about, did you ever hit your head? Nope, never hit my head, never passed out, never, except for when we got into the work that Bill and I do, working through the eyes. I wanted to check to see if we could see the pattern of the issue that we see when there's a concussion. When I got to the spot where there was a visual disturbance, she said, "Oh my God, about 4 years ago, right before I got vertigo, they were skiing, kind of skiing, being pulled behind a boat. And the person driving the boat was really jockeying around and kind of being a jerk and intentionally flipped them off of this inner tube. And she said, it rang my bell." Those were her words. And since then, for 4 years, she's had this terrible vertigo, which, is something that we were able to sort out for her. But she had no idea that this thing that was impacting her life stemmed from a moment in time. The other thing about that moment in time was she was so angry, and she's held a horrific grudge against that person for all those years. So it's something we see meshed together, a trauma, what you feel like is an emotional trauma with the head injury. Have you seen this? Is it a pattern that you have noticed as well, or anybody in the group?
I guess, and kind of to touch upon, I think it's, particularly now, there's no such thing as mild, because the way in which symptoms present means that a concussion is a concussion. And the challenge is we often look for that knockout. We look for that moment that people think the bell is rung. And I'm yet to hear that phrase from anybody in the UK, but I hear it frequently from America. But particularly, I'd say stunned is possibly the word we'd use here. Very stunned from an impact. I would say we see that kind of mangling of emotions. I'm not sure if they're, it's harder to disentangle with some. That is it emotions that things have stopped, so you get frustrated at yourself for not being able to do something, I think also comes into it. And there is definitely, we have one brain, and it's scary when we injure it. It's scary when we injure any part of us. But and to touch on your other point, it's because we don't see it, and particularly with, for me, concussion and mental health link really nicely in terms of, because nobody sees it, nobody gives it its respect. And the problem is they often then co-occur because we're not giving either of them respect. That's both as public, the communities around somebody that suffered a concussion, and the person with a concussion. I'll put my hands up and say I didn't respect my concussion and give myself the time to recover when I had a concussion. So those things are really important. And as you say, it can become quite hard to untangle some of those. And it partly can be that we've lost some of that capacity to deal with that day to day, not necessarily day to day, but those life events and bits, because actually a concussion has removed that kind of neurophysiological capacity and also our emotional capacity because we're injured. You wouldn't expect somebody that runs a marathon when they break their leg to then the next day run a marathon or run 5K. Frankly, you wouldn't expect them to run anywhere for 6 weeks. Yeah, we expect someone with a concussion to both handle life and be able to bounce back and be okay within, you hit your head, you'll be fine. And the problem is, and we were talking before, what is a concussion when it's only diagnosable by a clinician? We don't have a modality of imaging it. And I say we don't have a modality of imaging it because there's clearly changes to the brain. We just aren't sensitive enough to scan it. Or, sorry, we don't have a scan that is sensitive enough to see it. And actually, some of the things that people report after heading a ball or heading the ball for 30 times in a training session is, oh, I feel stunned. What's the difference between if that was a singular impact?
Yeah.
We don't know because we don't test regularly for those sort of kind of deficits.
Nathan, thank you. Give us just a couple seconds here for UK Health Radio. We've got to take a quick commercial break for them, and we'll be right back.
And we are back. We are talking with Nathan Howarth of the Concussion Legacy Foundation UK. And this is a really interesting conversation, I think, Nathan, and one that you don't hear a lot of about mental health and the possibility that the root of it might be in concussion. Is there much science behind that? Has the correlation been made? And my curiosity is, if it has, that could change a lot about how we deal with mental health issues.
Yeah, so there is some evidence out there, particularly if you look at prison populations are a key example because they kind of most frequently or most frequent population that has such a concentration of mental health. I remember talking to one psychiatrist that basically said, reductively, most of those people in a prison have had a hit to the head at some point in their life. We see it to a certain degree with CTE that kind of their behaviors, their mental health change with that kind of repetitive head impacts. So we know that mental health is related there. That is something that managed chronic traumatic encephalopathy can just lay as it lies to a degree, but it means actively managing the mental health component of CTE as a disease. In terms of there is some concrete work looking at those associations, which I know are ongoing in the UK, and broader field kind of work is being done. But the problem with head injuries, and particularly as with anything with kind of science, is it takes a lot of time for this data to come through in terms of big studies and longitudinal studies, because we want to capture people for a long period of time and actually define their head injury. Because, as I say, the difference between somebody heading a ball might be completely different to somebody else in terms of their level of G-force. We've seen that in some G-force studies in association football that they experience significant G-force in the Premier League through their head and don't have a concussion when we would expect a concussion to happen. So those models have to kind of ebb and flow with the individual people and the way in which forces flow through the brain. Within kind of, again, those broader populations, I wouldn't be surprised if there is that connection and causality between head impacts and frequent mental health kind of components. A lot of mental health sits with kind of childhood connections, if you believe particularly Freudian concepts of trauma and childhood trauma kind of becoming projected in other spaces. And there is obviously, as you say, that potential that, okay, kids are kids and they'll hit their heads on certain things. You can't stop a toddler from smacking their head as they fall over or running into a door. But potentially as we get older and things are, less kind of regenerative and restorative, then actually we need to be looking at being a bit more careful with our brains. And at the CLF we advocate for delaying contact sports. In America, flagged before 14, and kind of over here we particularly are supportive of the under 12s no heading trial, and kind of would like to see the raising of age for tackle rugby, particularly because it's just, although some of those skills are integral to adult sports, are they integral to the game those children are playing? Is the risk integral to those experiences that those children are going to have? I'm yet to see a 10-year-old football match where they are heading the ball to a proficiency where they will win a game for it. So why are we practicing heading? Why are we giving that risk? And I get that, heading needs a certain set of skills so that you don't then clash heads when you go up and actually head in a match. But also at the same time, our brain is really important. As we've kind of discussed, the potential impacts are both potentially lifelong if we are unaware of some of those implications through our cognition, and potentially lifelong with mental health if it's unmanaged and unrecognized. But, and potentially symptoms unchecked and unaddressed can be longer term. So actually head impacts and concussion should be taken seriously.
My curiosity is that more parents, I think, are not well informed. Just people in general are not well informed about the possible long-lasting effect of a concussion. And if they knew that for sure, the health impacts, the possible mental health impacts, the learning impacts, like all of that, if people were really well informed, would it change the way they think about having kids play impact sports where their heads are more at risk? We know that kids are going to be kids and they're going to knock their head. But the impact after impact after impact of sports has to have a cumulative effect. And I feel like maybe parents don't know.
Well, and it's a balance act. I'm more than aware in terms of, I still appreciate rugby, despite rugby having given me a concussion. I massively do. And, I guess it's the individual risk and knowing the risk. As I say, one of the challenges at the moment is we can't quantify what that risk is. And to a degree, that risk will change as we get more data and we've also got more awareness. So is some of it a true reflective nature of how risky sports are? Don't know. And I balance it with, we should also be doing sport for our kids. We should also be getting them outside and adventurous. We shouldn't have a generation glued to mobile phones. So actually we should balance everything we're saying in terms of the risk factors by going, the risk of having a generation that grows up glued to iPads, telephones, that don't exercise, that are obese, have all of the associated health conditions and health burden with things like obesity and inactivity. That's just as big of a potential public health crises as repeatedly hitting our heads. So actually that balance has to be met in terms of people understanding their risk, but also if we get to a stage where people do knock their heads and there is that repetitive nature of knocking their head and head impacts, that we understand when to relax, when we take time out because our brain needs to recover at some point, and particularly then recognize concussions and appropriately treat and deal with them. And that's making sure that parents are adequately equipped, medics are adequately equipped, and making sure schools and sports teams are adequately equipped to dealing with particularly that kind of vulnerable age group. And I know that there's been widespread debate here in some academics calling contact sport without consent child abuse. I think that's a really problematic way of looking at it, particularly for parents, because that invokes some really strong emotions, and it's not child abuse, or not in our eyes. If you believe that it's informed enough that, you know, you are undertaking those sports for the reasons that you want your kid to learn discipline, to let energy out, that's okay. Just balance what you are doing, you know. Don't take any of the contact sports when we've got boxing and things like that going on. And but at least within, to a degree, you know, there are certain stand down times in boxing. I'm not saying boxing is necessarily good. It's not my favorite sport. But it's about having those checks and balances, because particularly, you know, in some areas we have to have that. And I think informed discussion with parents, rather than telling them they're doing wrong, is a challenge, because actually what happens if my kid wants to do it? Well, as long as they're safe and you feel like you can have the discussions about recognizing a concussion, making sure that their teammates might recognize somebody changing performance, change post a head impact, a header, anything, that look out for each other. You know, the word's but big and ugly enough and scary enough without, you know, concussions adding to it. Let's look out for each other, and that's what sports teams are generally good at, looking after each other. But let's make sure we look after them in those contexts.
Beautiful. So we want to do this again. I know what Liz is thinking. We got to have you on again and go even deeper. And we have a whole range of subjects that we want to talk more about on this. Everything from your digestion to what part of your car, when you do get in an accident, do you actually get hit in? Or what part of your body is the part that keeps getting hurt, and its relationship to your concussion? So we want to expand on this with you. Tell us, how do people get involved with the Concussion Legacy Foundation? How do they help? How can they find out about your resources, if you could?
Absolutely. If you Google the Concussion Legacy Foundation, you'll come to our website. We have both a US page with resources and our UK subchapter if you wanted the Concussion Legacy Foundation UK. So that's how you can get us. We've got numerous resources. Our helpline is also there if you're ever struggling. And there is a phone number there for the phone number is mainly for brain donation for those that are of interest in, and it's an imminent brain donation if that is so. But yeah, all our resources are easily Googleable, if that's a word, or easily Googled at Concussion Legacy Foundation.
This is beautiful. Everyone out there, this is the world's largest foundation dedicated to this. They've got the resources for you. This is Bill and Liz with Cognomovement.com. We are so happy to have this guest on today. If you want to know more, Cognomovement.com.
Yeah, thanks for being here, Nathan. And everybody in UK Health Radio Land, be safe and be well. And we will see you again next week.
Thanks for being here with us on the New Life Perspective radio show. For more information or to find out more about the work that Bill and I do, please visit us at cognomovement.com or email us at info@cognomovement.com. See you again soon.